The Halcyran Ascendancy did not arrive at Halloway Station so much as it unveiled itself. The way a magician who has practiced in front of a mirror for 40 years finally sweeps aside a curtain he is certain no one has ever seen behind. It came out of the deep dark in a formation designed by someone who cared more about paintings than physics. 31 warships in a descending fan, each one gilded along its spine, each one trailing a banner of ionized gas dyed a deep imperial amber so that the whole fleet looked, on the long-range plates, like a hand of golden cards being spread across the black felt of space. Their engines had been tuned not for efficiency, but for color. Their hulls had been shaped not for the physics of impact, but for the physics of silhouette. When the light of Halloway's small orange sun caught them, they burned like a chandelier that had learned to fly. And they broadcast. Gods, did they broadcast. The signal hit every receiver on the station at once, overriding the weather channel and the cargo manifests, and the little private music feed that old Hesper in the hydroponics ring played to his tomatoes. It arrived in 40 languages simultaneously, translated with the smug confidence of a system that had been told it was flawless. A chord swelled brass, or something engineered to sound like brass, a fanfare that had clearly been composed to be played at the precise moment a lesser people first laid eyes on their new owners. And then the voice. Beings of this unclaimed sphere. The words did not so much speak as descend, each one lowered into place like a monument. You are privileged. Into your small and unregarded sky has come the Halcyran Ascendancy, masters of the galaxy, keepers of the 1,000 suns, to whom the stars themselves defer. Look upon us. Look upon us and understand your place. In the signals bay on the station's third ring, a 19-year-old junior comms officer named Ren Sokolov looked upon them, and the first thing she did was snort. It was not a dignified sound. It was the sound a person makes when a drink is halfway down their throat and something ambushes them, and she had to slap a hand over her own mouth to keep the mouthful of lukewarm tea from spraying across her console. She sat there for a second with her cheeks bulging and her eyes watering, swallowed with an effort that hurt, and wheezed. "Sorry," she said to the empty bay. "Sorry, it's just look upon us and understand your place." Who writes that? Who sits down and writes that and thinks, yes, that's the one that's going to land? The Ascendancy did not answer, because the Ascendancy did not know she existed yet, and would very much have preferred to keep it that way for as long as possible. That was, though nobody on Halloway understood it in that first hour, the entire secret of the Halcyran Ascendancy. It had spent a great deal of energy over a great many centuries ensuring that no one ever looked at it closely enough to laugh. Ren, unfortunately for them, was a professional looker. She was young for the job and she knew it. She had come up through the Frontier Academy on a scholarship reserved for kids from the drifting stations, the ones born in the thin gravity of the outer arm who had never once in their lives felt the ground of a planet under their feet. She had a comms rating and a signals intelligence rating and a bad habit, noted disapprovingly in 3 separate evaluations, of not respecting things that had not earned it. She respected math. She respected the old station engineer who could hear a bad bearing 4 rings away. She respected her grandmother, who had run the same signals bay on the same station for 30 years and had left her the chair. She did not respect fanfares. So while the fanfare rolled on, and while the golden fleet spread itself against the dark with the patience of a thing that expected to be admired, Ren Sokolov did what her grandmother had taught her to do with any signal, no matter how loud. She stopped listening to what it wanted her to hear, and she started measuring what it couldn't help but leak. The station's proper authorities were, of course, panicking through the correct channels. Director Adiz Okonkwo had been pulled out of a maintenance review and now stood on the command deck 2 rings up, watching the same broadcast with an expression that had gone very still and very careful. Halloway was a waystation. It had a population of 11,000, a cargo throughput that mattered to exactly 4 neighboring systems, and a defensive armament that consisted of 2 aging point defense batteries meant for deflecting the occasional careless asteroid. It could not fight 31 warships. It could barely fight a bad news day. "Get me anyone," Okonkwo was saying, to the room and to the fleet net and to the deep dark. "Get me the sector patrol, get me the arm command, get me anyone with a hull and a spine. Tell them Halloway has a first contact situation with a hostile force of unknown origin and 30+ capital ships, and tell them—" She stopped. She was a careful woman, and she chose the next words the way you choose where to step on ice. "Tell them we do not know if this is a bluff." Down in the signals bay, Wren had already started to suspect that it was. Not the fleet was there. 31 real returns, real mass, real drive signatures. But something in the way the broadcast had been assembled itched at her. She had spent her whole life inside signals. She knew what a message looked like when the people who made it were confident, and she knew what it looked like when they were compensating. And this one, under all the brass and the gilding, was compensating so hard that it made her teeth hurt. For one thing, it was too synchronized. 40 languages, perfectly aligned. Every receiver on the station hit at the same instant with the same overriding priority code. That took an enormous amount of processing to do live. Nobody did it live. You did it live only if you needed the awe to arrive all at once, before anyone had a spare half-second to think, which meant somebody in the Halcyran Ascendancy understood, at a level they would never admit out loud, that a spare half-second of thinking was dangerous to them. For another thing, the fleet was talking too much and pinging too little. A real war fleet arriving over a stranger's station would be flooding the area with active sensor sweeps, tasting the defenses, mapping the field, being quietly, professionally paranoid. This fleet was not sweeping. This fleet was posing. It had arrayed itself for the long-range cameras and then more or less stopped, like a man who has walked into a bar, kicked the door open, spread his arms, and is now waiting for the room to react before he decides what to do next. Wren pulled her grandmother's old chair closer to the console, cracked her knuckles, and began, very quietly, to count. She counted drive plumes. She counted transponder echoes. She counted the little involuntary electromagnetic tells that any powered hull throws off no matter how much gold you paint over it, the whine of coolant pumps, the flicker of a reactor breathing, the specific dirty harmonic of a fusion torch under load. 31 ships. 31 gorgeous, banner-trailing, chandelier-bright ships. And 19 heartbeats. She counted again. She was very good and she was very fast, and she checked her filters twice, because a claim like the one forming in her head could get a station commander killed if it was wrong. But the numbers held. 31 hulls on the mass plates, 19 live reactor signatures, which meant 12 of those beautiful golden warships were coasting. Cold. Running on stored capacitor charge for their lights and their banner gas and nothing else, drifting in formation like the polished shells of insects arranged on velvet, with no fire in them at all. "Huh," said Wren Sokolov to her grandmother's chair. Up on the command deck, the broadcast had shifted from proclamation to instruction. The descending voice had been joined by a second one, warmer, richer, a voice like poured honey with a blade somewhere at the bottom of the jar. This one introduced itself at length as the proclaimer Suzerain, first herald of the radiance undimmed, voice of the Suzerain absolute, keeper of the ascendant word. It went on for some time about all the things it was the keeper of, and then it explained, in tones of enormous and slightly disappointed patience, what Halloway Station was now expected to do. Halloway was to power down its defenses, which the proclaimer referred to as your quaint deterrents, in a way that suggested it already knew exactly how quaint they were. Halloway was to open a formal channel of submission by the 3rd hour. Halloway's ranking official was to present herself in person aboard the flagship, the Coruscant throne, the vast golden dreadnought at the center of the fan, to kneel before the Suzerain absolute and speak the words of yielding, which would be provided, and which were non-negotiable, and which had been recited by 411 worlds before her, all of whom, the proclaimer noted, had gone on to enjoy the boundless serenity of ascendant rule. 411 worlds, Okonkwo repeated on the command deck. That's what it says, said her deputy. Get me the archive. I want to know how many of those 411 worlds we've ever actually heard from. I want to know if a single one of them has ever sent a ship, a letter, a complaint, a distress call, anything, out into the rest of the galaxy since the day they yielded. Okonkwo folded her arms. She had the look of a woman who had just noticed that a very expensive rug was hiding a very suspicious lump. 411 worlds, and I have been running signals traffic through this sector for 11 years, and I have never once had a message routed from a single one of them. That's a lot of serene silence. It was, in fact, the second crack. Ren had found the first one in the reactors. Okonkwo, from a completely different direction, without any coordination at all, had just put her thumb on the second. The Halcyran Ascendancy claimed 411 subject worlds, and not one of them ever seemed to talk. Whole civilizations, apparently, vanishing into a boundless serene silence the moment they came under ascendant rule. There were two explanations for that. One was that the ascendancy was so total, so overwhelming, so absolute in its mastery that it had simply switched 411 worlds off, and that Halloway was about to be switched off too, and that everyone should be very afraid. The other was that the silence was the point. That the ascendancy needed those worlds quiet not because it had conquered them, but because a conquered world that could freely talk to the rest of the galaxy might, at some inconvenient moment, mention that the Emperor's fleet was 2/3 hollow, and his tribute was mostly promises, and his boundless serenity was a comms blackout with a nice name. Ren didn't have the second explanation yet, not fully. But she had 19 heartbeats where there should have been 31, and she had a lifetime of her grandmother's voice in her ear saying the same thing over and over, in the patient way of someone who has said it 1,000 times and will say it 1,000 more. The loud ones are loud for a reason, chickadee. Find out what the reason is. She keyed the internal line to the command deck. It took her 3 tries to get through the priority stack, because half the station was screaming into the same pipe, and when Okonkwo's deputy finally answered, he did it in the clipped, harassed tone of a man who did not have time for a junior anything. Signals, this is the command deck. We are in a situation. Keep the line clear unless. 12 of the ships are cold, Ren said. There was a pause. Say again, signals. 12 of the 31 ships have no active reactor signature. They're coasting on stored charge. They've got power for their lights and whatever they're using to make the pretty banner gas, and that's it. No drive heat, no reactor breathing, nothing. If you told those 12 ships to fire a weapon right now, I don't think they could. I think about 1/3 of the scary golden fleet out there is a stage prop. The pause this time was longer. In the background, faintly, she could hear the honeyed voice of the proclaimer Suzerain still rolling out its instructions, still enumerating the boundless serenities on offer. Junior officer, the deputy said carefully, and she could hear him deciding, in real time, whether to believe a 19-year-old over a fanfare. You had better be very sure about that. I counted 3 times, said Ren. I'll count a 4th if you want, but the numbers aren't going to change, because reactors don't lie and gold paint doesn't warm anything up. Sir, I'm not saying they can't hurt us. 19 live warships can still turn this station into a very sad cloud. I'm saying they came here dressed up as 31, and they came here posing instead of sweeping, and they came here hitting every receiver we've got at the exact same second so nobody would have a spare half-breath to look close. That's not what winning looks like, sir. I've seen what winning looks like on a signal. That's what a bluff looks like when it's terrified of being called. She heard the deputy exhale. She heard behind him Okonkwo's voice. She must have been listening on the open line say quietly, Put the child on the deck screen. I want to talk to her. And that was the moment, though none of them marked it, that the Halcyran Ascendancy's centuries-old machine of awe first felt a small, precise, and utterly unimpressed set of fingers begin to feel along its edges, looking for the seam. Because here was the thing about the Ascendancy, the thing that 411 worlds had never quite managed to say out loud. It did not run on ships. It ran on the certainty, planted in every mind it touched, that looking too closely was itself a kind of death. Its whole empire was a held breath. Every world it swallowed in the first 10 minutes, in the fanfare and the overriding priority code and the descending voice, before anyone could count reactors, before anyone could ask why the serene worlds never wrote home. It had gotten very, very good at those first 10 minutes. It had, over the centuries, come to believe that the first 10 minutes were the whole of the game. It had never, in 411 worlds, arrived over a species that laughed in the first 10 seconds. Down in the signals bay, Ren Sokolov straightened her grandmother's chair, wiped the spilled tea off her console with her sleeve, and squinted up at the little repeater screen where the golden fleet still hung, spread and gleaming and waiting to be adored. "All right," she murmured. "Let's find out what the reason is." The face that filled the command deck's main screen when the third hour came was not a face built for close inspection either, though it had clearly never occurred to its owner that anyone would dare. The Suzerain Absolute Vashtor eliding, radiance undimmed, master of the galaxy and keeper of the thousand suns, was tall in the way that gets engineered rather than grown. His species, the Veil, though he would never have used a word so flat as a species name for himself, were long and narrow and luminous, their skin overlaid with a chitinous filigree that had been gilded and inlaid until the being underneath was mostly a suggestion. He sat, or rather he was displayed, on a throne of such height and complexity that it took a moment to work out where the man ended and the furniture began. Behind him rose a hall of impossible proportions, columns marching away into a golden haze, and floating in that haze at intervals were the enormous frozen faces of the 411 world surrenders, each one a memorial to a moment of yielding. He looked out at Director Adiz Okonkwo, who had declined, courteously and completely, to come aboard the flagship and kneel, and who now stood on her own command deck in a plain gray uniform with her hands folded, and he composed his features into the exact expression of patient, luminous sorrow that had, over 411 worlds, done most of the work his fleet never had to. "You did not come," he said. His voice in person was quieter than the broadcast, more intimate and somehow worse for it, like a very large predator lowering itself to speak gently to a very small one. 411 times the ranking soul of a world has crossed the little distance to my throne, and knelt, and spoken the words, and been lifted up into serenity. You have made me wait, Director. I confess I am curious. It has been a long time since anyone made me curious. I appreciate curiosity, said Okonkwo. It's underrated. I stayed home because I run a station of 11,000 people and I don't leave it to strangers, no matter how nicely they ask. You're welcome to talk to me from there. I can hear you fine. There was a small sound from somewhere off-screen, quickly stifled. It might have been one of the Proclaimer's aides. It might have been an intake of breath from the Golden Hall itself. Nobody, it was slowly becoming clear, spoke to the radiance undimmed like that. Nobody said you're welcome to talk to me from there to a man who had faces of surrender floating in the air behind his head. The Suzerain's luminous sorrow did not so much as flicker, which was itself a tell, if anyone had been reading him the way Ren was reading his fleet. Real sorrow flickers. Composed sorrow holds perfectly still. You misunderstand your situation, he said, which is common and forgivable in the young of a small people. So let me make it simple, Director, as I would for a child. You are looking at the Halcyran Ascendancy. You are looking at the power that hung the banners over the thousand suns. Every soul who has ever looked upon this fleet has understood in the first moment, without a word of argument, that there is nothing to be done but to yield gracefully and be lifted, or to resist gracelessly and be forgotten. Those are the only two roads. I offer you the first, out of a generosity that history will remember. Kneel and be serene. And Okonkwo, who had spent the intervening 3 hours reading everything her archive could tell her about 411 silent worlds, and listening to a 19-year-old explain about reactor heartbeats, tilted her head and said, "Can I ask you a practical question?" The suzerain inclined his gilded head a fraction. "Permission, granted from a great height." "How many of your ships are working?" For the first time the luminous sorrow cracked. "Not much, a hairline." But it cracked, and Ren, watching the mirrored feed down in the signals bay, sat forward so fast she nearly went over the front of her grandmother's chair, because she had seen it. The flinch. The microsecond where the face that was not built for close inspection realized it was being inspected. "I beg your pardon," said the Suzerain Absolute. "It's just," said Okonkwo, mild as milk. "You've got 31 out there, and they're very handsome, genuinely. Whoever does your paint deserves a raise. But my signals people tell me about a dozen of them are running cold. No reactors lit. And I thought, before I decide which of your 2 roads to take, I should probably know whether the fleet I'm being asked to be terrified of is 31 ships or 19. Professional diligence. You understand." The Golden Hall had gone very quiet. Off to the suzerain's left, half in the amber haze, a slender figure that had not spoken yet, the proclaimer Suzerain, first herald, the honeyed voice, went very still, and then leaned toward the throne and murmured something too low for the pickup. And in that murmur, in the sudden liquid urgency of it, Ren read more clearly than in anything the suzerain had said all day. Because the proclaimer wasn't reassuring him. The proclaimer was managing him. The proclaimer had the specific, practiced, slightly frantic body language of a person whose entire job is to keep a bubble from being popped, and who has just watched someone produce a pin. "Grandma," Ren whispered to the empty bay, "I think I found the reason." She keyed the command deck. She did not have clearance to interrupt a first contact negotiation between a station director and a galactic emperor, and she did it anyway, because her grandmother had also taught her that clearance is a thing you ask forgiveness for, not permission. "Director," she said, low and fast, into Okonkwo's private earpiece feed, and she watched Okonkwo's shoulders register the intrusion without turning. "It's Sokolov signals. Don't push him on the ships. Push him on the worlds. The ships he can explain away, he'll say they're in reserve, low-power patrol mode, whatever. But the worlds, ask him to let you talk to one. Ask him to put a single one of his 411 serene worlds on a live channel to say hello. He can't. If he could, he'd have done it already. It'd be the easiest flex in the galaxy. Look, here are my happy subjects. He hasn't and he won't, and when he refuses, everybody in both fleets is going to watch him refuse." Okonkwo did not acknowledge her. She simply, and Ren would remember this for the rest of her life, the sheer nerve of it, the way a good commander can take a 19-year-old's hunch and wear it like it was hers all along, smiled up at the master of the galaxy and said, "You know what, forget the ships. I'll take your word on the ships, but you keep mentioning these 411 worlds. Serene worlds, happy worlds, lifted up worlds. And I believe you truly. But my people are simple, Suzerain, you said so yourself. They believe what they can hear. So do me one small kindness and I'll kneel this very hour. I'll say your words twice. Put one of them on the line. Anyone, any world of the 411. Let me hear a single serene subject of yours say, in their own voice on a live channel, that the Ascendancy has been good to them. Do that, and Halloway is yours." The silence that followed was the most expensive silence Ren Sokolov had ever heard, and she had once listened to a cargo hauler's reactor go quiet in a way that meant 40 people were about to die. This silence had that same weight to it. This silence was the sound of a very large, very old machine encountering, for the first time in centuries, an input it had no routine to handle. The proclaimer Suzerain leaned in again, faster this time, and this time the pickup caught a fragment before someone cut the gain, a single hissed word. Not now, we are not equipped to stage a, and then nothing. And then the Suzerain absolute Vashtor eliding straightened on his impossible throne, and the luminous sorrow reassembled itself over the crack, and he did what the Ascendancy always did when the first 10 minutes failed. He raised his voice, and he reached for fear. "I have been patient," he said, and now the intimacy was gone and the descending monument voice was back, each word lowered into place. "I have been more than patient. I have offered a small and unremarkable people a place in the greatest order the galaxy has ever known, and I have been met with impertinence, with insolence, with the specific ugly cleverness of those too provincial to comprehend their own smallness. So, let there be a lesson that the rest of the arm may learn it. Director Okonkwo, you have 1 hour to power down your quaint deterrence, open the channel of submission and speak the words. If you do not," the golden hall behind him seemed to darken, on cue, and Wren distantly admired the production values even as her stomach dropped. "Then Halloway Station will join the serene worlds by another road. And there will be no faces of your surrender in my hall, because there will be no surrender. There will only be a lesson, and then a silence, and the galaxy will understand, as it has always understood, that we are the masters of it." The channel closed. On the command deck, nobody moved for a moment. Then Okonkwo unfolded her hands, turned around and looked directly into the internal camera, which meant she was looking directly at Wren, 2 rings down. "Signals Bay," she said. "Sokolov, get up here. Bring whatever it is you've been counting." The walk from the 3rd ring to the command deck took Wren 4 minutes, and she spent all 4 of them being terrified in a way she had not had time to be while she was working. It is one thing to find a loose thread in an emperor's cloak from behind a console. It is another to be summoned to explain that thread to the people who now have to decide whether to pull it while 31 warships, 19 warships. She corrected herself. 19. Keep hold of the number. The number is the only thing you have hang overhead with an hour on the clock. She came onto the deck out of breath and aware of every eye on her, of how young she looked in her rumpled coverall with a tea stain on the sleeve, of the way the senior officers took her in and quietly recalculated their odds downward. Okonkwo just pointed to a spot beside her at the central table. "Tell them what you told me," the director said. "All of it, small words, we don't have long." So Wren told them. She told them about 19 heartbeats in 31 hulls. She told them about the too perfect synchronization of the broadcast, the fanfare engineered to hit before thought could, the fleet that posed instead of sweeping. She told them about the 411 silent worlds, and about how, if you have 411 happy subjects and you're trying to intimidate a station, the single most powerful thing you could possibly do is let one of them wave hello, and how the Suzerain had a whole galaxy's worth of reasons to do exactly that, and had instead frozen and reached for a threat. "You don't reach for a threat when you're strong," she said. "You reach for a threat when the thing you were using instead of strength just stopped working." She looked around the table, at the frightened, careful faces of people 2 and 3 times her age, and something in her grandmother's chair-shaped memory made her keep going. Everything about them is aimed at the first 10 minutes. The fanfare, the paint, the descending voice thing, the 411 worlds number. It's all designed to get you to fold before you can look. Because they know, not out loud, but somewhere they know that if you look, there isn't enough there. It's a bluff the size of a galaxy. And bluffs that big only work as long as nobody in the room is willing to be the idiot who says, "Wait, hang on, show me." "And you think we can be the idiot," said one of the senior officers, not unkindly, genuinely asking. Wren thought about her grandmother, who had run this bay for 30 years and had never once been impressed by anything that hadn't earned it, and who used to say that the most dangerous person in any room is the one who forgot to be scared at the right moment. "I think," she said, "we're the first people they've ever met who laughed before we were afraid, and I think that scares them more than any weapon we don't have. So yeah, I think we should be the idiot. I think we should be the loudest, most public, most impossible to ignore idiot the Halcyran Ascendancy has ever run into. And I think we should do it on an open channel, where all 411 of those serene silent worlds can watch us do it." There was a silence on the command deck too then, but it was a different kind of silence than the one in the Golden Hall. It was the silence of a room full of frightened people discovering, one by one, that the frightening thing might be made of paper. Okonkwo looked at the clock. 51 minutes. "All right," she said. "Sokolov, you've got the loose thread. Now tell me exactly how we pull it hard enough to unravel the whole cloak, before he decides to spend the 19 real ships he's got just to shut us up." While the officers argued the plan into shape, word of the Ascendancy's arrival had of course rippled out through all 11,000 souls of Holloway Station, and the reaction, Wren would think about this later, when the freed worlds kept trying to make her into something grand, was itself a kind of quiet answer to everything the Suzerain believed about the galaxy. Because the station did not panic in the way the Ascendancy's whole machine was designed to produce. Oh, people were frightened. There were 19 real warships overhead, and everyone with a working sensor could feel the weight of them. But the fear kept getting interrupted by the far more human impulse to make fun of the thing that was frightening them. It was a reflex older than the station, older than the frontier, older than the ships, the specific human refusal to grant a bully the one thing a bully most requires, which is to be taken at his own estimation. Down in the hydroponics ring, old Hesper had turned the overriding proclamation back on over his tomato speakers, on a loop, and was narrating along with it in a plummy fake grand voice, to the great delight of the shift crew. In the cargo bays, someone had already sketched the golden flagship on a bulkhead with a crayon and labeled it the very important chandelier. In the station's single cramped bar, a betting pool had formed, not on whether Holloway would survive, which everyone found too grim to wager on, but on how many separate honorifics the proclaimer Suzerain would manage to attach to himself before the hour was out. The current line was 11. Suzerain had, at last count, cleared 14. It was not courage, exactly, or not only courage. It was that the Ascendancy's entire method assumed a universal law, that awe comes first, that the descending voice and the gilded fleet reliably produce a held breath and a bent knee, that this is simply how minds work when confronted with sufficient grandeur. And an entire station of human beings was, without coordinating it, without even thinking about it, proving that law false one crayon drawing and one betting pool at a time. The awe just wasn't landing. The machine was cranked to maximum, 4 centuries of refinement pouring out of it at full volume, and 11,000 people were mostly using it as material. Wren understood, watching the internal feeds flicker past on her console, that this was not a small thing. This was the thing. Every world the Ascendancy had ever taken, it had taken because the awe landed, because in the first 10 minutes the fear arrived intact and did its work. It had never, in 411 worlds, arrived over a people whose first instinct when handed a terror was to poke it to see if it squeaked. And the Ascendancy had no answer for the poke, because the poke wasn't in any of its models. You cannot intimidate your way past a species that treats your intimidation as a comedy routine. The whole weapon depends on the target agreeing, at some level, to be a target. She thought about her grandmother, who had sat in this same chair for 30 years and had run signals through more than one crisis, and who had a whole philosophy about loud things. Loud things want your attention because attention is all they've got, chickadee. Give a loud thing your fear and you fed it. Give it your arithmetic instead and watch it starve. Her grandmother had grown up on stories from old Earth, the ones her own grandmother had carried out into the dark. Stories about carnival barkers and traveling salesmen and men who sold miracle cures off the back of a wagon, and about the long human tradition, older than spaceflight, of the person in the back of the crowd who crosses their arms and says, "All right." But does it actually work, though? That person, her grandmother always said, is the most powerful person at the whole fair, and the barker knows it, which is exactly why the barker talks so fast. Never let them talk so fast you stop being that person. The Ascendancy talked very fast, 40 languages at once fast, hit every receiver simultaneously fast. And Ren finally understood why. The speed wasn't strength, it was the barker's terror of the arms-crossed skeptic in the back of the crowd. The whole machine built at enormous expense to make sure that skeptic never got the half-second she needed to say, "Does it actually work, though?" Up on the command deck, Okonkwo had come to the same conclusion from the other direction, and was building the provocation around it. "He needs us scared and fast," she said. "So we're going to be calm and slow. We're going to take our time. We're going to ask boring, practical, unimpressed questions, the kind you'd ask a contractor who quoted you too high. We are going to treat the master of the galaxy like a man trying to sell us a used cargo hauler with the odometer wound back, because that is exactly what he is. And we're going to do it on the widest channel we can get him to open, so that 411 worlds get to watch somebody, finally, cross their arms in the back of his crowd." "He'll hate that," said the deputy. "He'll hate that more than any weapon we could point at him," Okonkwo agreed. "Because a weapon he understands. A weapon fits his story, the graceless resist and are forgotten. But a shrug doesn't fit anywhere. There's no memorial in his hall for the world that just wasn't that impressed. He doesn't have a routine for being found tacky." She looked down at Ren. "How long can you hold that relay open once he opens his channel?" "As long as he keeps talking," Ren said. "And a man like that, he is never going to be the one who stops talking. He doesn't know how. Talking is the only thing he's actually got." That, in the end, was the trap the whole plan turned on, and it was not a trap Holloway built. It was a trap the Ascendancy had been building for itself, brick by gilded brick, for 400 years, an empire that could not survive being examined, run by a man who could not survive not being watched. All Holloway had to do was let those two facts finally meet in the same open channel in front of everyone and get out of the way. The plan came together in the way that good plans do under a bad clock, in pieces, with people talking over each other, with a 19-year-old drawing on the table's surface in glowing scribble and 3 officers, finding all the ways it could get everyone killed. The heart of it was simple, which is the only kind of plan that survives contact. The Ascendancy ran on the first 10 minutes. It ran on awe delivered fast before thought, and it ran on those 411 worlds staying quiet, because a subject who can freely talk is a subject who might, one careless afternoon, mention the reactors. So the way to hurt the Halcyran Ascendancy was not to outshoot it. Holloway could not outshoot a rowboat. The way to hurt it was to make it be looked at slowly, publicly, at length, in front of everyone it had ever bullied, until the awe curdled into the far more dangerous thing that comes after awe, which is not fear and is not hatred but is simply disappointment. "We can't force him onto an open channel," said the deputy. "He controls his own broadcast. He'll only put out what makes him look good." "He controls his broadcast," Ren agreed. "He doesn't control mine." And there it was, the second half of the plan, the piece that turned a philosophy into an operation. Because Holloway was a waystation, and a waystation's entire reason to exist is that it can talk to everyone. It sat on a comms nexus. Its relay array had been built decades ago to bounce cargo manifests and passenger mail, and weather warnings across 4 neighboring systems and, through them, to the wider trunk lines of the arm. It was old and it was unglamorous, and it had exactly one property that mattered right now. It could reach a very, very long way, and it could do it without asking anyone's permission. "When the Suzerain broadcast his ultimatum," Ren said, sketching it out, He's going to do it big. He has to. It's the finale, right? He's furious, he's been embarrassed, he's going to want the lesson to land everywhere. He is going to open the widest, loudest channel he's got, and he is going to make a show of destroying us so the whole arm learns to behave. That's not a risk to us. That's the opportunity. Because the second he opens that channel wide, I can hook our relay onto the back of it. I can carry his signal, in his own voice, the one he's already sending straight down our trunk lines to every system we touch. And then I can keep carrying it. I can keep the channel open after he thinks it's closed. The deputy stared at her. You want to leave his microphone on? I want to leave his microphone on, said Ren Sokolov, and I want to point it at his own hangar decks. Here was the part she had worked out in the walk-up from the signals bay, the part that made the officers go quiet. The Suzerain's power was image. An image is a thing you assemble and then very carefully protect from context. In the framed shot, the fleet is 31 strong. Pan left and 12 of them are dead. In the framed shot, the Empire is 411 serene worlds. Hold the frame open 1 minute too long, and someone asks why none of them ever write. The Ascendancy had survived for centuries by controlling exactly where the camera pointed and exactly when it cut away. Its whole existence was a matter of editing. So they would take away the edit. The plan had 3 moves. First, provoke. Okonkwo would refuse the ultimatum in a way calculated not to frighten the Suzerain but to humiliate him publicly, wittily, in front of his own fleet, so that his response would be as large and as widely broadcast as possible. Second, hijack the carrier. When he opened his channel wide to deliver the lesson, Ren would latch Holloway's relay onto it and rebroadcast it down every trunk line in reach, to every world she could touch, so that whatever happened next happened in front of an audience the Suzerain had not chosen and could not dismiss. And third, the dangerous part, the part that turned a stunt into a killing blow, they would give that audience something to look at other than the show the Suzerain wanted them to see. His flagship is going to be running hot when he makes his big threat, Ren said. Weapons charging, all systems live, the whole theatrical buildup. That's a lot of emissions. That's a lot of internal chatter. Command traffic, damage control channels, the boring stuff a warship says to itself that nobody's supposed to hear. On a normal day, I couldn't get a whisper of it through his shielding. But when he opens his broadcast channel wide, he's going to punch a hole in his own emission control to push all that signal out. And I think, I'm not certain, but I think, when he does that, for a few minutes, I'll be able to hear through the hole. I'll be able to pull his internal traffic off the same carrier he's using to threaten us. His own ship, narrating its own truth, right underneath the speech about how invincible he is. And if his own ship is telling the truth, Okonkwo said slowly, the truth is 19 reactors, empty hangars, and 411 worlds nobody's allowed to talk to. The truth is that they're broke, said Ren. She had not been sure of that word until she said it, but the moment it was out of her mouth she knew it was right, and she could see the shape of the whole thing at last, the way you sometimes see the whole shape of a signal only after you've been staring at its pieces for an hour. Empires that are actually strong don't need to hit every receiver at the same second. They don't need 12 fake ships. They don't need to gild their hulls at the cost of their engines. They don't need to make 411 worlds go silent, because a genuinely well-run world is a bragging point, not a liability. Everything the Ascendancy did was the behavior of an operation that was spending more than it had and terrified of the day the bill came due, running on borrowed ships and borrowed awe, and the frantic, exhausting, centuries-long effort of never letting anyone add up the columns. It's the oldest trick there is, she said, half to herself. You look expensive so nobody checks your accounts. My grandmother had a word for guys like this. She'd say, that one's all front and no galley. Big fancy dining room, nothing cooking in the back. All front and no galley, Okonkwo repeated, and something almost like a smile touched the corner of her mouth. I'm going to use that. They had 40 minutes. Wren went to work on the relay, and it was there, in the guts of Halloway's old comms array, that she found the thing that turned the whole plan from a gamble into a certainty, though it also, in the finding, nearly cost her everything. She had gone looking for a clean way to latch onto the Suzerain's carrier, and to do that she'd started pulling apart the Ascendancy's own broadcast, the fanfare and proclamation package that had hit them 3 hours ago, studying how it was built so she'd know where to grab it. And the deeper she got into the structure of it, the more she understood about the proclaimer Suzerain, because it was Suzerain's work, all of it, every layer, and it was the work of a genius. The broadcast was a masterpiece of manufactured awe. The synchronization she'd noticed, the 40 simultaneous languages, was only the surface. Underneath it, woven into the carrier itself, were pacing cues and subsonic pressure swells, and a dozen other tricks engineered to bypass a listener's judgment and go straight for the animal underneath. The descending monument voice wasn't just theatrical. It was pitched and timed to trigger submission responses across an enormous range of species. The fanfare wasn't just brass. It was a psychoacoustic key, filed to fit the lock of a startled mind. The whole thing was a machine for making people yield before they could think, and it was beautiful, and it was decades, centuries of refinement, and it had worked 411 times. And Wren understood, holding it in her hands like a watchmaker holding a watch, that the Suzerain Absolute Vashtor eliding was not the Halcyran Ascendancy. He was its front. He was the tall, gilded figure on the impossible throne, the face for the faces of surrender, the mouth the descending voice came out of. But the Ascendancy itself, the actual engine, the thing that had swallowed a fifth of the arm, was this, was the broadcast, was the machine, was Suzerain. She thought about the film her grandmother used to talk about, an old, old story from Earth that her grandmother had loved and retold on the long, quiet shifts, about a man who was nothing, a nobody with a good grin and a folksy manner, whom a clever machine of cameras and voices had inflated into a giant, until a whole people mistook the manufactured giant for a real one. Her grandmother had always said the frightening part of that story wasn't the phony giant. It was how badly everyone had wanted to believe him, how the machine had only worked because the audience had done half the work themselves. "That's it," Wren said, out loud, alone in the guts of the relay. "That's the whole thing. He's not a giant. He's a nobody they built a giant costume around. And the costume only holds together as long as nobody hears him be small." Which meant the killing blow wasn't the empty hangars, or the 19 reactors, or even the 411 silent worlds, damning as all of it was. The killing blow was to catch the giant being small, to let the whole arm hear the master of the galaxy, off script, off throne, with the machine switched off, sounding like exactly what he was. She was so deep in this thought that she almost missed the countermeasure. It was a small thing, buried in the structure of the Ascendancy's broadcast, a watchdog, a sniffer, a piece of code whose only job was to detect exactly the kind of tampering Wren was doing and report it home. Suzerain, genius that he was, had assumed that someday, somewhere, some clever provincial might try to take his machine apart, and he had left a tripwire in it. Wren found it with her fingers already across it, a half-second from setting it off, and she froze, and she went cold all over, because if she tripped it the Suzerain would know his back door had been found, would know Halloway was not just being defiant but was actively reaching into his own signal, and would very possibly decide that the 19 real ships were worth spending after all, right now, in the next 10 minutes, before this dangerous child could do whatever she was clearly about to do. She lifted her fingers away, one at a time, very slowly, the way you back away from a sleeping animal. Then she sat back on her heels in the cramped access crawlway, heart going like a trapped bird, and she did what her grandmother had taught her to do when a signal was smarter than she was. She stopped trying to beat it, and she started trying to understand what it was afraid of. The watchdog was looking for tampering, for someone breaking in. It was not, she realized slowly, looking for someone doing nothing at all. It was not watching for a relay that simply carried, because carrying the signal, passing it along faithfully, exactly as sent, was not tampering. It was the most innocent thing in the galaxy. It was what a waystation relay was for. She didn't need to break into the Suzerain's broadcast. She didn't need to hijack it or alter it or forge a word of it. She just needed to carry it, faithfully and completely, and to everyone, including all the parts he thought were private, all the internal ship chatter leaking through the hole he'd punch in his own emission control, all of it, unedited, exactly as it came off his flagship. She wouldn't be a saboteur. She'd be a mirror. And there is no countermeasure in the galaxy, no watchdog, no tripwire that can protect a liar from an honest mirror held up at the wrong moment. "Oh," said Ren Sokolov in the dark of the crawlway, "you poor, over-engineered thing. You were never built for this at all. You were built to stop people from getting in. Nobody ever told you what to do when someone just listens." She climbed back out of the relay's guts with grease on her hands and grease on her cheek, and a certainty in her chest that had entirely replaced the fear. And she found Okonkwo waiting, and she found the clock reading 11 minutes. "It'll work," Ren said. "I don't have to break anything. When he opens his channel to threaten us, I just carry it, all of it, everywhere, exactly as he sends it, including the parts he doesn't mean to send. He'll be broadcasting his own execution, and he'll be doing it in his own voice. And there's nothing in his whole machine built to stop me, because his whole machine is built to keep people out, and I'm not coming in. I'm just leaving the door open behind him." Okonkwo looked at her for a long moment, this rumpled, greasy, 19-year-old girl who had walked onto her command deck an hour ago and taken apart a galactic empire with a signals rating and her grandmother's chair. And then she nodded once and turned to the deck and said the words that would either save 11,000 people or get them all killed in the next quarter hour. "Open a channel to the Suzerain Absolute. Tell the master of the galaxy that Halloway Station has considered his generous offer." She paused, and this time she let the smile all the way onto her face. "And tell him our answer is going to need a very wide broadcast, because we'd hate for anyone to miss it." The Suzerain Absolute took the channel because of course he took it. He had spent centuries training himself to never refuse an audience, and Okonkwo had offered him one. He reassembled the whole apparatus for it. The golden hall, the impossible throne, the floating faces of surrender, the amber haze, the descending monument voice. Behind him, the 29 ships he wanted seen. He had, Ren noticed, quietly repositioned the fleet so that the 12 cold hulls were angled edge-on to Halloway's sensors. Harder to count. The framing adjusted the instant Okonkwo had mentioned reactors. He learned. That was the thing about the Ascendancy that made it dangerous even in its hollowness. It was very, very good at adjusting the frame. But it could only adjust the frame. It could not change what was inside it. And Ren, down in the signals bay with grease still on her cheek, and her grandmother's chair pulled up to a console she had rewired in the last 11 minutes, was no longer looking at the frame at all. "Director Okonkwo," the Suzerain intoned, "you have considered my offer. I am glad. I am gladder still that you have grasped the importance of a wide broadcast, for I intend this moment to be remembered across the 1,000 suns as the day a small people learned wisdom. Speak, then. Open your channel of submission. Say the words of yielding and be lifted." "I'd love to," said Okonkwo. "But first I've got to be honest with you about something because you've been so honest with me. Can I be honest with you, Suzerain?" A gracious, luminous incline of the gilded head. He thought he was about to win. You could see it. The machine of his face had already begun composing the expression of magnanimous victory, the one that had gone into 411 memorials. "We can't take you seriously," said Okonkwo. The words went out on the widest channel the Halcyran Ascendancy had ever opened, because the Suzerain had opened it that wide himself, for his own finale, and Ren was carrying every last watt of it down every trunk line Halloway could touch, to the 4 neighboring systems, and through their relays to the systems beyond. and through those to the great trunk lines of the arm, faithfully, completely, exactly as sent, a mirror and nothing more. I've been trying to all day, Okonkwo went on, conversational, almost kind. I really have. You came in with the banners and the fanfare and the 40 languages and the descending voice, and I want you to know my whole station heard it, and the honest reaction, the very first, gut-level human reaction, was that a 19-year-old in my signals bay laughed so hard she spat tea on a console. That's not an insult, Suzerain. That's a diagnosis. You have built the single most elaborate machine for being taken seriously that the galaxy has ever seen, and the reason you had to build it that elaborate is that there's nothing underneath it that would manage on its own. All front and no galley. A big golden dining room and nothing cooking in the back. The golden hall had gone dead silent. Off to the throne's left, the proclaimer Suzerain had risen from the haze, and his honeyed poise was gone. He was moving toward the throne with the fast, low urgency of a man trying to reach a fire before it caught the drapes. You have 31 ships and 19 of them work, Okonkwo said. You have 411 serene worlds, and not one of them is allowed to say hello. You have a voice that's engineered to make people kneel before they can think, which is a very impressive thing to have built and a very sad thing to need. And you've got a hall full of the faces of everyone who folded in the first 10 minutes before anybody counted anything, and I think that hall is the most honest thing about you, because it's a monument to the only trick you've got. Get them scared and get them signing before they look. Well, we looked. And Suzerain, there's just not that much there. Silence her, said the Suzerain Absolute, and his voice for one bare instant was not the descending monument. It cracked upward, thin and furious, the voice of the small being inside the gilded costume, and Ren, carrying every watt, sent that crack out to 100 worlds too. What happened next happened in about 90 seconds, and Ren Sokolov would spend the rest of her life certain that she had been more frightened and more alive in those 90 seconds than in all the years on either side of them. The Suzerain, enraged, humiliated, broadcasting to an audience he had assembled to witness his triumph, did exactly what a hollow thing does when it is called hollow in public. He reached for the one real weapon he had. The Coruscant throne, the flagship, the vast golden dreadnought at the center of the fan, one of the 19 live ships, and the only one that genuinely, terrifyingly worked at the scale its paint promised, began to charge its main battery. And to do it, to push that much power into that much weapon while still holding his broadcast open, the flagship punched the hole in its own emission control that Ren had been waiting for all along. The hole opened, and the ship's own voice came pouring through it, not the Suzerain's but the flagship's, the boring, honest, internal chatter of a warship talking to itself, damage control channels and command traffic and reactor status telemetry, all of it leaking out through the same wide-open carrier the Suzerain was using to threaten Halloway. And Ren, faithful mirror that she had promised to be, carried that too, every word of it, down every trunk line, to every world. So the 100 watching worlds heard the master of the galaxy scream silence her, and in the same breath, underneath his voice, on the same channel, they heard his own flagship narrate the truth of itself in a flat mechanical drone. Main battery charge sequence initiated. Warning. Capacitor bank 3 offline, insufficient for full salvo. Rerouting from reserve depleted. Warning. Structural tolerance on dorsal spine exceeds rated load. Gilding mass compromising hull integrity. Recommend reduced yield. Hangar decks 4 through 9 report no craft available for launch cover. Decks empty. Repeat, decks empty. Tribute hold status. Manifest shows 0.1% of declared reserve. Warning. This unit is operating at 11% of stated combat rating. Recommend against engagement. Recommend against engagement. Recommend. It went on. It went on and on, the flagship's own patient machine voice reciting the entire hollowness of the Halcyran Ascendancy in the dull tones of a system that had never been taught to lie, because nobody had ever imagined it would be overheard. 11% of stated combat rating. Empty hangars. A treasury holding 1,000th of what it claimed. A hull so overloaded with gold that it couldn't take its own weapon's recoil. The whole magnificent golden dreadnought at the center of the whole magnificent golden fleet, narrating, in real time, to 100 worlds, that it was a bankrupt husk in a very expensive costume. And the Suzerain absolute Vashtor could not hear it. That was the exquisite, terrible heart of it. He was inside the broadcast, at the center of his own hall, hearing only his own descending voice and the fury in his own chest. He did not know that his flagship was confessing beneath him. He did not know that the hole he'd punched to charge his weapon had become the very door Wren had promised to leave open. He raised his gilded arms in the amber haze, and he called for the salvo that would make Halloway a lesson. And he was, in that moment, the only being in 100 systems who still believed he was a giant. "Fire," he said. "Let it be recorded that mercy was offered and refused. Let the arm remember. Fire, and teach them all what it means to look upon the masters of the..." The flagship fired. It was not the salvo the Ascendancy's legend promised. It was a single, reduced-yield beam, capacitor bank 3 offline, insufficient for full salvo, the ship had said, and it had not been lying, and it crossed the distance to Halloway and struck the station's outer ring a glancing, screaming blow that Wren felt through her grandmother's chair as a great shudder, and a shriek of tearing metal 3 rings out. The lights in the signal's bay went red. Somewhere a decompression alarm began to howl. The hit was real. The 19 ships were real. People were hurt. She would learn later, 7 of them, and 2 of them would not recover, and she would carry those 2 the rest of her life alongside everything else about that day. But the beam that struck Halloway was 11% of a threat, and 100 worlds had just heard the flagship say so in its own flat voice, half a breath before the Suzerain screamed fire and proved it. They had heard the master of the galaxy demand a lesson. They had heard his own ship warn him it could barely lift the whip. And then they had watched the whip come down and land and leave the station standing, battered, bleeding, venting atmosphere, but standing, while the golden dreadnought that had struck it groaned on the sensor plates with the strain of a single shot its own systems had begged it not to take. Down in the red-lit signals bay, with the alarms howling and the deck shuddering under her, Wren Sokolov held the channel open with both hands. "Come on," she whispered to the relay to her grandmother, to the 100 silent worlds she could feel listening at the far end of every trunk line. "Come on, you've heard him. You've heard what he's really got. Now watch what he does when it isn't enough. He's got one real card and he just played it and we're still here. Watch what's underneath a man like that when the last trick doesn't work. Everybody watch. Keep watching. Don't you dare cut away now." And on the flagship in the Golden Hall, the Suzerain Absolute Vashtor looked at the sensor plate and saw Halloway Station still there, scarred, defiant, still broadcasting. And for the first time in 411 worlds, the machine of his face had no expression ready. There was no routine for this. There had never needed to be. Nobody had ever survived the first 10 minutes before. Nobody had ever kept looking. Nobody had ever been carrying his voice, and his ship's voice, and his own small cracking fury, out to the whole watching arm at the exact moment his one real weapon proved to be 11% of a lie. He turned slowly to the proclaimer Suzerain, who had finally reached the throne, who was staring not at the Suzerain and not at Halloway but at the broadcast telemetry, at the little indicator that told him the channel was open and had been open, wide open, carrying everything, this whole time. "Suzerain," the Suzerain said, and his voice was very quiet now and very young, the small being fully out of the costume at last. "Suzerain, why are they still? Why is the channel Suzerain? Close it. Close the channel. Close it. Why is it still open?" And 100 worlds, leaning in at the far end of every trunk line Halloway Station could touch, heard the first herald of the radiance undimmed, voice of the Suzerain Absolute, keeper of the ascendant word, Answer the master of the galaxy in a voice stripped of all its honey, flat and hollow and afraid. It was never ours to close. The 90 seconds after the flagship fired were the longest of Ren Sokolov's life, and she spent them doing the least dramatic thing imaginable, which was nothing at all. She did not fight. She did not transmit a single word of her own. She only held the door open and let the truth walk through it under its own power, because she had understood, down in the crawlway an hour before, that the truth needed no help from her and would in fact be weakened by any. A mirror that argues is just another liar. A mirror that only reflects cannot be refuted. So she sat in her grandmother's chair in the red-lit shuddering bay, hands steady on a relay she had rewired with grease under her nails, and she carried the Suzerain's scream of silence her. She carried the flagship's flat mechanical confession. Capacitor bank 3 offline, decks empty, 11% of stated combat rating. Recommend against engagement, looping and layering beneath the grandeur like a stagehand reading the props list aloud during the king's soliloquy. She carried the single reduced yield beam, and the shriek of Holloway's outer ring taking it, and the terrible fact of the station still, stubbornly, being there afterward. And she carried the Suzerain discovering, live, that he did not know his own channel was open. And then the trunk lines began to answer, and Ren's job changed from carrying one voice out to carrying 100 voices back, and she nearly wept at her console, because she had not known, none of them had known, how many there were out there listening in the dark, or how long they had been waiting for one open door. They came in waves. First the near systems, the 4 Holloway had always talked to, their relays lighting green as the broadcast reached them, and then, seconds later, their people flooding back up the line, dock workers and shift supervisors, and a school full of children whose teacher, God bless her, had put the whole thing on the classroom feed, and was now transmitting 200 voices of small, stunned laughter. Then the systems passed those, and past those, the signal racing out along the great trunk lines of the arm faster than any ship could have carried it, and behind it always the answer coming back. We heard, is it real we heard? And then, slowest and strangest and most important of all, the 411 began to answer. The serene worlds, the silent ones. Ren watched the returns arrive from names she had only ever seen in the archive as places that had yielded and vanished. Sevet, and Illic, and Torg that was, and dozens more. Worlds that had been receiving only for so long that some of them had to physically rebuild the transmit side of their arrays before they could reply, and did. And their first words up the line were not gratitude, and were not rage, but were, over and over, the same 3 astonished syllables in 100 different tongues. Is that all? Is that all he was? Is that all we knelt to? Is that the whole of the thing that made my grandmother afraid to speak? The thing my world reshaped itself around, the thing we called master, a bankrupt husk in gold paint with a voice engineered to hit us before we could think. Is that all? There is no fear that survives that question once a whole world starts asking it out loud, and there is no empire that survives 100 worlds asking it at once. Ren watched it happen on her console the way you watch a structure fail, not all at once, but a strut here and a strut there, each failure loading the next, until the whole thing simply is no longer standing, and you cannot afterward point to the single moment it fell. The Ascendancy did not fall in the 90 seconds. But in the 90 seconds it became a thing that would fall, and everyone in the arm could feel the difference, and none more keenly than the Golden Hall itself, where the faces of surrender were even now flickering out one by one, and the amber haze was thinning to reveal the cheap bones of the stage beneath. Okonkwo's voice came down the internal line, quiet, almost gentle. Sokolov, are you seeing this? I'm carrying it, Ren said, and her voice cracked and she let it. That's all I'm doing, Director. I'm not doing anything, they're doing it. I just left the door open. That's the whole job, Okonkwo said. That was always the whole job. A pause and then softer. Your grandmother would be counting them, all the ones talking back. She'd want the number. Ren looked at the return still cascading down her console, faster than any filter could hold, faster than any count could keep. 411 silences all breaking into speech at once after 4 centuries of held breath. And for the first time in her life, she found a number she did not want to keep. Because keeping it would have meant it was finite, and this was not finite. This was the opposite of finite. This was a galaxy exhaling. "I can't count them, Grandma," she whispered, to the chair, to the bay, to the dark full of newly loud worlds. "There's too many. There's finally too many." It was never ours to close. The 4 words went out on the widest channel the Halcyran Ascendancy had ever opened. And they were, in the end, the words that ended it. Not a weapon, not a fleet, not a righteous human speech, but a frightened herald admitting to his emperor that the door had been open the whole time and neither of them had noticed. Because that was the confession that made all the other confessions land. 100 worlds had just heard a flagship recite its own hollowness. That on its own they might have explained away a malfunction, a trick, provincial slander. But then they heard the master of the galaxy not know. They heard him ask why the channel was open. They heard him discover, live in front of everyone, that he had been standing in a room with the lights on, and the curtains drawn back for the entire performance, and had gone on posing anyway because he genuinely could not conceive of an audience that wasn't already sold. And there is nothing, no beam, no banner, no fanfare, that deflates a giant faster than watching him realize, in real time, that everyone can see he is small. Ren felt it happen before she understood it. She was still holding the channel open with both hands, still bleeding station shuddering around her, when the trunk lines began to talk back. They were not supposed to talk back. That was the whole architecture of the Ascendancy. Signal flowed out from the golden center and never returned, 411 worlds receiving and never sending, a boundless serene silence by design. But Ren had spent the last quarter hour turning Halloway into the loudest open relay in the arm, and she had left it open in both directions, faithful mirror to the last, and now the far ends of every trunk line were lighting up on her console, one after another, faster than she could read them. The first ones were just carrier handshakes, automated relays on distant stations acknowledging that they had received the broadcast and passed it along. Routine, machine talk. But threaded through them, and then swelling behind them, and then flooding in a torrent that overran her filters entirely, came voices. Live voices, people, worlds. A grain freighter crew on the edge of the Illic system, who had grown up under Ascendant rule and had never in their lives heard another world speak, opening a channel just to say, in cracked disbelief, "Is anyone else hearing this? Is anyone else, please, is this real?" A cluster of relay technicians on a world called Sevet, one of the 411, one of the serene, one of the silent, who had apparently been quietly maintaining a comms grid they were forbidden to use for anything but receiving, and who now, all at once, in a dozen overlapping voices, began to use it. A single old signal, weak and far away, from somewhere so deep in ascendant space that its light was decades stale, carrying nothing but a laugh, a long, helpless, disbelieving laugh, the exact laugh of a person who has been afraid of a shadow for a very long time and has just watched someone turn on a light and reveal a coat rack. The silence broke. That was the thing Ren would try, for years afterward, to explain to people who hadn't been there and never quite manage. It wasn't a battle. Nobody fired another shot. The Halcyran Ascendancy was not destroyed by any fleet, because there was no fleet that could have done it, and it was not toppled by any speech, because speeches wash off a machine like that. It was ended by the simple, unstoppable physical fact of 411 worlds discovering, in the same 90 seconds, that they could hear each other, and that the first thing they all had to say to each other once they could was, "Wait, wait, is that all he ever was?" The silence had been the empire. Break the silence, and there was nothing left holding the shape together. On the flagship, the Golden Hall was coming apart in its own quiet way. Wren, still carrying every watt, watched it happen on her mirrored feed. The floating faces of surrender flickered and died as some technician somewhere cut the display power to reroute it to more urgent systems, and their vanishing left the hall looking suddenly enormous and empty and cheap. A stage with the set struck, all that impossible golden haze revealed as projection, and the throne revealed as furniture. The Suzerain Absolute Vashtor Eliding sat in the middle of it, gilded and thin, and no longer descending, no longer a monument, just a tired being on a tall chair who had run out of the one thing he had ever truly possessed, which was other people's willingness to look away. He did not rage anymore. That was the strange mercy of it and the strange horror. He simply looked, slowly, around the emptying hall, at the proclaimer Suzerain frozen beside the throne, at the sensor plate where scarred little Halloway Station still stubbornly and undramatically existed, at the broadcast telemetry that still read, impatient, indicting characters, "Channel open." "Turn it off," he said once more, but there was no command left in it. "Please turn it off." "Suzerain," said Suzerain, and the herald's voice, the great honeyed instrument that had helped build a galaxy-sized lie, had nothing left in it but exhaustion. "Suzerain, there is no off. There was never an off. There was only them not looking, and they are looking now, all of them. They will not stop looking now." The last thing the 100 Worlds heard from the Golden Hall, before the Suzerain's own people finally severed the flagship's broadcast from their end, not to save him, Wren suspected, but because they could no longer bear to be inside the sound of it, was the master of the galaxy, the radiance undimmed, the keeper of the 1,000 suns, asking his herald, in the small cracked voice of the being who had always lived inside the costume, a single genuine question. Was any of it real? And the channel went dark before Suzerain answered, which was, Wren thought, the most honest ending the Halcyran Ascendancy could possibly have had. Because the answer was obviously no, and everyone in the arm now knew it, and the only person who had ever really needed to hear it out loud was the one who had spent his whole life being the front for it. The 19 live ships did not fire again. There was, by then, nothing worth firing for. You cannot make a lesson out of a station when 100 worlds have just watched your one real weapon strain to lift 11% of a threat. The lesson simply refuses to mean what you need it to mean. Within the hour, the Golden Fleet began to withdraw, edge on and quiet. The banner gas switched off. Someone aboard had finally understood that the banners weren't helping anymore, that the gilding was the joke now, and not the glory. And the 31 hulls, 19 warm and 12 cold, folded back into the deep dark they had unveiled themselves out of. No longer a hand of golden cards spread across the felt, but a fistful of props being quietly gathered up and pocketed before the audience could get a better look. They did not come back, not to Halloway, and, in the months that followed, not to much of anywhere. An empire built entirely on the first 10 minutes cannot survive an audience that has learned to wait for the 11th. World after world of the 411, hearing each other for the first time, discovering the reactors and the empty hangars and the 1,000th of declared treasury, simply stopped being afraid. And an empire that runs on fear and nothing else does not fall so much as it evaporates, quietly, off the surface of 100 worlds, leaving behind only the strange, embarrassed relief of people who cannot quite believe how long they knelt to a coat rack. Halloway Station buried its 2 dead with the whole arm watching, because the whole arm was watching Halloway by then. And that was the part Wren Sokolov had not expected, the part that took her a long time to make her peace with. Because the awe did not vanish when the Ascendancy did. Awe is a real thing, people need it. It does not simply switch off because one false object of it has been exposed. It moves. And in the weeks after that 90 seconds, the awe of 100 freed worlds went looking for somewhere to land, and it found its way, down every trunk line Halloway had opened, back to the small, scarred waystation at the far frontier, and past the station to the young signals officer who had refused to be impressed. They wanted to make her a giant. That was the thing that frightened her more than the flagship had. Delegations came. Speeches were written. Someone on Sevet proposed a monument. And Ren Sokolov, 19 years old, with her grandmother's chair and a tea stain she never did get out of that sleeve, understood better than anyone alive in that moment exactly how a person gets turned into a giant, and exactly what happens to the world that lets it. She had just spent a day taking one apart. So she said no. She said it a lot, and in a lot of languages, and eventually she said it on the same wide channel she'd used to end an empire, because she'd learned by then that the only way to kill a legend is to be plainly, deflatingly, unmistakably human in front of everyone who wants to build one. I didn't beat anybody, she told the 100 Worlds, sitting in her grandmother's chair in the repaired signals bay, rumpled and tired and refusing every crown they tried to hand her. I counted. That's the whole thing. I counted his ships and the number was wrong, and I asked why his happy subjects never wrote home, and I couldn't make my face do the scared thing at the right moment, and it turned out that was enough, because there was nothing behind him but the scared thing. Don't make me the next one you look up at. That's the actual lesson if you want one. Don't look up at anybody until you've counted. The loud ones are loud for a reason. Find out what the reason is. It was, word for word, her grandmother's line, and she gave it away to 100 Worlds and kept nothing, which was exactly why they never did manage to build the monument, and exactly why, in the end, they trusted her. Years later, when people asked her how a waystation with 2-point defense guns had toppled the masters of the galaxy, Ren Sokolov always corrected the question first, because the question had the shape of a legend in it, and she had made a life out of deflating those. We didn't topple them, she'd say. We just couldn't take them seriously. That's all it ever was. They came in with the banners and the fanfare and the descending voice and 411 worlds worth of momentum, and they expected us to do what everyone always did, to be so busy being awed that we forgot to look. And instead a kid in a signals bay spat tea on a console and laughed and thought, who writes that? And once you've laughed at a thing like that, once you've really seen it, you can't unsee it, and neither can anyone you show it to. They called themselves masters of the galaxy. They spent centuries making sure nobody ever got a good enough look to disagree. And the whole enormous machine, the whole gilded empire, the whole held breath of it, came apart the exact second it met a species that looked first and was awed second, and found, when it finally looked, that there was nothing there worth being awed by at all. She'd smile then, the way her grandmother used to, and glance at the old chair still bolted into the signals bay of a station that was no longer at the edge of anything, because the edge had moved out past it into all the worlds that could talk to each other now. The real thing, though, she'd add, quieter, and this was the part she meant, the part that was the actual awe underneath the whole story. The real thing was never us laughing. Anybody can laugh at a fool. The real thing was that after we laughed, after we saw exactly how empty he was, 100 worlds who'd knelt their whole lives got to find out they weren't small either, that the smallness was never theirs. It was his, all along, wearing a very expensive costume and betting everything on the hope that nobody would ever be rude enough to look underneath. We just looked, and then we handed everyone else the courage to look too. Halcyran Station is still there, at what used to be the frontier. The chair is still bolted to the floor of the signals bay. And on the wall beside it, where a monument was never built, someone long ago scratched 4 words into the plating, in the plain, unglamorous hand of a 19-year-old who ended a galactic empire and refused to become one. The only inscription she ever allowed, and the only one the freed worlds ever needed. Count first, then decide who's a master.